Hey folks, what's up? It's Jamie from Books and Ladders, and today I have a review of The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon for you. I don't have a physical copy of this book because I listened to it as an audiobook, and I do so through Libro.fm, and if you're interested in using them, you can see a referral link down below. So no pretty covers of the books to hold up, but I will have one on the screen for you so that you can see what it looks like. So let's jump right into this review. As always, any content warnings will be in the description box below, and I will keep this review as spoiler-free as possible, which may not be super easy since it is a Reylo fanfic. And for the uninitiative, that's Rey and Kylo Ren fanfiction from Star Wars. So let's talk about what this book is about, other than being a published fanfiction, which is becoming more and more popular lately, but that's a whole other thing. The Hurricane Wars is a romance fantasy or romantasy book that is the first in a trilogy of novels that is set in a Southeast Asian inspired world that is ravaged by storms. We follow Talasyn, who is an orphan with light magic, and Prince Alaric, who is the heir to the ruthless throne that has dark magic, and their escapades together. As bitter enemies with opposing magical powers, they find themselves drawn together through the Hurricane Wars. Talasyn's light magic, which is thought to be eradicated, and Alaric's shadow magic clash together to create a magical force beyond anybody's wildest dreams. Despite their enmity, they recognize that a greater threat looms, and so they join forces together to combine their magical powers to overcome it. Amidst the turmoil, a passionate and complex relationship blooms between them, which adds an extra layer of tension in this novel. This novel promises an exquisite fantasy with memorable characters, an enemy-to-lovers romance, and a vividly crafted world, which sets the scene for this trilogy. So let me start by saying that I didn't even know that this was a Reylo fanfiction, and didn't actually put two and two together until they talked about a lightsaber, and then kind of backtracked and thought, wait a second, this is very science fiction, but is supposed to be fantasy, read the reviews, and realized what I was reading. And not that it's a bad thing that there is fan fiction or taking inspiration from characters and creating something entirely new. It just felt really off for me afterwards because I couldn't stop imagining it in the world of Star Wars, which meant that it read more like science fiction to me rather than fantasy, and I think that's where it started to break down. Also, if you haven't seen all three of the new Star Wars trilogy, there actually are some spoilers in this book for how that trilogy ends. So just keep that in mind if you are interested in watching that and just haven't gotten around to it, and we're going to pick up this book. I also am always weary about enemies to lovers because a lot of times they're not actually enemies and not even really rivals. They just have a couple lines of not liking one another and then get together. But I do actually think that this did a pretty good job of making them enemies and then having them grow to be something a little bit more than that, but still recognizing that there is animosity between them. And we see that throughout the entire novel. Even on like the last page, there is still that distrust between them, even though there's something growing that they think is going to be something more, which will probably develop into something more in the second book. I will say I think the majority of the issues that I had with this book revolve around the fact that it is fan fiction and blatant fan fiction. It's not even inspired by, but things are really different and we're only keeping a few things together. It is basically just an AU or alternative universe where the two characters that the author wanted to get together, but kind of everything else stays the same. And don't get me wrong, I love fanfiction. It's basically all I read for like 15 years of my life, because I too wanted certain characters to get together and also wanted them to have like a cozy coffee shop instead of, you know, fighting demons and monsters. And also having that queer baiting in TV shows to not really see it resolved meant that a lot of times you had to turn to fan fiction to see some of those different relationships, different elements really pan out, because it wasn't commercially approved at the time that I was reading these. But with all that in mind, it just felt too much like Star Wars. I have only seen the first two of the last trilogy and then snippets from the third in that last Star Wars trilogy, and even I could recognize that this was Star Wars. It didn't feel like it was set in a fantasy world. It felt like it was set in space. And because of that, I was really thrown off. I had to actually go back and make sure that I was reading a fantasy novel because it just didn't feel like it. And also, because we were under the premise, or at least people that probably walked into this with more knowledge than I did, were under the premise that this was a Reylo fanfic, you didn't have to do as much exploration or explaining at the beginning of the novel to get us to like the characters, because we were going in with the assumption of who the characters were and what their actual internal goals were, with the idea that they would just end up together at the end. So it didn't really add to the premise of the novel, or there wasn't as much world building or character development throughout the first 25% of this novel, because we were basically walking in with the assumption that we knew the characters. And that's fine in fanfiction because we typically do, right? We're seeking out some sort of wish fulfillment that isn't shown to us in that typical medium that we are looking for in another place. But in a novel that isn't supposed to actually be part of that canon, so it's not like this was written for the Star Wars Disney imprint that there are a lot of novels coming out for. This was supposed to be something inherently different. It just didn't read that way because we were supposed to go in under the premise that we knew the characters. And so we didn't get as much development of the world, of the characters, of even the magic system that we probably should have if this was, supposed to be something entirely different. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some really well-developed scenes in the beginning part that try to make this stand apart from what it is, fanfiction. And I think some of those actually do a really good job of that. Like I said, it wasn't until they mentioned some of the elements that really triggered it for me that it was Star Wars that I felt like I was in that universe. But then once I knew, I couldn't take myself out of that. And I think that's what my main issue with this was. I didn't go on AO3 and search for this specifically, but it was given to me instead. And because of that, this wouldn't have been what I chose to begin with. I'm not a fan of Reylo in general, but also I just felt like I couldn't then separate that from what the story was supposed to be. And this is even marketed that way, so it's not just me projecting this onto the novel. This is literally how it's marketed to people, which I obviously missed because I wasn't really looking for it to begin with. And so I didn't see that marketing element until much later after, when I was reading other people's reviews saying, this is what it is, this is Reylo fanfiction. It just wasn't marketed to me that way originally until I actually went back and saw some of the reviews and really read through the description. I just saw it was nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award and it was on sale, so I picked it up, and that's kind of the story of where we are now. Because honestly, if I had known that this was a Reylo fanfiction, I might not have picked it up. I am not a fan of that relationship or the depictions of it, and so I just would have passed on this one entirely. I think part of the other problem is that we get a little muddled in the middle. So where we should be seeing some of this plot move forward and side characters really begin to develop, they just turn into pieces to move towards that romance element. It almost feels like we're then stripping away some of the fantasy elements, or they're becoming the backseat to the romance itself. And that's fine. I've read lots of books that are under that romantasy umbrella where the plot is just there and it's to move forward with the people falling in love. And it works well in some cases, but I think it doesn't here because the world isn't as developed, or there's the thought that the world should be developed and the plot should be the main point, but then we're falling back to the romance instead of trying to understand the world, what's happening, and why we're even doing what we're doing. There is kind of a shift in the middle from, this epic fantasy to a romance dramedy. And I am not sure why that happened or where you can see like a specific shift, but it does happen pretty abruptly in the novel. And because it really goes from epic world building, epic fantasy to, these two people are just trying to fall in love, I feel like we stepped away from making this into a trilogy into something that probably could have just been a standalone book, rather than, expanding upon this for multiple stories and at some point probably close to 2,000 to 3,000 pages. even to get to the point where they are forced to be together and we go from that real where enemies were on opposite sides to we're together and falling in love, meant that a lot of characters made some really weird choices. They went from being smart, thoughtful choices to, well, how do we make sure that they're together? And it almost felt like they were out of character, and we didn't even really know the characters that well to begin with. But from logical perspective to illogical, because we want these characters to basically be in the same room, happened so quickly that it didn't really make sense, and is part of the reason that it really shot me out of the story. That's where we started to see some of the fan fiction that was kind of underlying up until that point really come to the forefront, because instead of flushing out this novel into something that could have been this epic fantasy with, a slow burn enemies to lovers, they were forced together, and we were forced to just have them be together in a way that, was good for the romance portion, but wasn't as great for the fantasy portion, which is supposed to be the driver of this novel. We're supposed to care about the magic, about how they work together, about the fact that light magic hasn't been seen in X amount of years, but now here it is, and really kind of takes away from the specialness of the novel itself to just force these characters to be together. I think I would have preferred to see a subtle shift in how they start to see one another, from that enemies to that lovers, and really make it a little bit more slow burn, rather than it being so apparent in their shift in thinking. Like, they went from thinking about the other person in a negative light to a positive light in basically 2 sentences. And so, because this really, what sold me was that this is the best depiction of enemies to lovers, I just didn't get that out of this. I thought that there could have been more elements of, yeah, sure, maybe we're forced to work together in this scenario, but that doesn't mean I like you, and I still think of you as my enemy, and not even thinking about you in a positive way. But that just didn't happen. It went from, wow, we worked really well together, we should be mech pilots, basically. We basically went from I hate you to I love you in 2 thoughts. So instead of getting that real slow burn element of enemies, because they are enemies, they're on opposite sides of this war and then are forced to come together, I just wish it took a little bit more for them to be forced to come together, and also for them, once they're together, to actually like one another. I just feel like we didn't get enough of the enemy portion to really feel rewarded with the lover portion. But that means I see where the appeal comes in for why this has widely positive reviews. And that's because it follows all the systematic elements of being a romantasy novel. It has the plot structure you're looking for, the banter between the characters, the appropriate amount of time of them being separate and then back together, and is just exactly what people are looking for when they talk about romantic fantasy novels. I feel like if you like a lot of the really popular romantasy novels right now, then this will be something that you also enjoy, or probably have also read at this point, because it's been out for a couple years and the next book should be coming out pretty soon. But for me, it just didn't have the right pacing, the right structure, the right elements of it being a fantasy for me to be okay with the romance taking the center stage. Because a lot of times with these types of novels, it is the romance that takes the center stage and the fantasy is just there for it to be there. But because this started out being pretty fantasy heavy and then doing a, whiplash type of change into the romance, I felt like it could have been something a little bit more than just your standard checkbox romantasy of, yeah, the plot's there, we're moving along, there's enough intrigue for people to keep interested, but we then have to make sure that the characters are falling in love with banter, with pining, with slow burn enough to make people interested, and then, some sex, because there is that on page. I just wish that this had a little bit more of the fantasy element throughout the entire book, rather than the second half of it taking up just the romance pieces of it. I feel like this is one that the romantasy readers will love and enjoy, and might actually get some people who are a little hesitant to read the genre into it firmly, because it has all the right markings. There's enough of the story that feels familiar to you that it would make you want to read it, especially if you really like Star Wars, and just generally speaking is something that is easily digestible. But for me, it just felt like a slog to get through. especially once we got to the point where we stopped caring about the fantasy and really just moved on to the romance, when it was kind of marketed to me as more of the opposite, where yes, there's romance, but there is fantasy. And I think it was just shown to the wrong type of people for my interest group, rather than being marketed to the book readers who really want that enemies to lovers that changes pretty abruptly because they want to see the actual romance with just a few lines of banter rather than literally hating one another. And those who really like things like Blood and Ash. And I'm not saying that those aren't good books, they're just not the ones that I reach for all the time. I went into this expecting at least a 4, if not a 5-star novel, and am pretty disappointed that I only rated it 2 stars. I think if this had been even just a little bit different in terms of plot and structure and not feeling like fan fiction, I might have actually enjoyed it more. When I finished, I thought, maybe this is a 3-star novel, 3.5 star. But as I started writing out my review, I realized that a lot of the elements I liked weren't necessarily part of this, but were part of that Star Wars themed element. And I felt like I couldn't give credit to the author for putting those in when somebody else developed them. So I do think that maybe part of my issue is just that I shouldn't be reading books that are, qualified fan fiction that have been turned into something different. And I didn't read the original fan fiction, but I'm sure there had to be some immaculate changes to make sure that the main characters weren't just carbon copies of the characters that they were based on. And you do see some of that, I'm not going to say that you don't, but I just couldn't picture them as anybody else because of the world and the descriptions. So it just didn't end up being the book for me. So if you're looking for something that's really trope heavy and a romantasy, I actually think you'll really enjoy this book. I think that there's, it's obviously really well received and people really enjoy it. It just obviously wasn't the book for me. It's not really my cup of tea. I think there is a place for a fanfiction type novel and stories to be retold through the lens of different cultures, different identities, queer retellings. Like I said, I read a lot of fanfiction because of queer baiting in TV shows that actually highlighted and supported those types of relationships. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. I just think that there was too much of the fanfiction element and too many elements that made me think, yes, I remember this scene specifically in Star Wars, or could see how we shift this scene from Star Wars to this book for me to really enjoy it and get behind the story itself. And so that's my review. I think the audiobook narrator did a fantastic job. I really enjoyed listening to it. I found myself not zoning out, which sometimes happens if the audiobook narrator isn't that great. So I do actually highly recommend listening to it on audiobook if that's how you decide to do it. Like I said, there will be a referral link for Libro.fm if you are so inclined. Not only do you get audiobooks, but you support independent bookstores by purchasing audiobooks through them. But if you want the gorgeous cover to be sitting on your shelf, you can also use my affiliate link for bookshop.org, which is down below. And yeah, let me know in the comments if you've read this, if you agree or disagree with me. I'm not opposed to people liking this book. It just definitely wasn't the book for me. So until next time, happy reading. Bye.